They thought I wouldn't find out. That's the first mistake people make when they underestimate someone they've already betrayed. They assume silence means ignorance, that calm means blind loyalty. I was in my office late that Tuesday, finishing a quarterly report when my phone buzzed. A friend from college, Mark, sent a message I almost ignored. "You need to see this." Attached was a photo from a rooftop bar in Chicago. My wife, Emily, leaning into my business partner, Chris Miller. His hand on her waist, her laugh frozen mid-frame. I stared for a full minute, not because I didn't believe it, but because a part of me had always known. That night, I didn't confront either of them. I went home, made dinner, and said nothing. I wanted them comfortable, predictable. People make mistakes when they think you're still asleep at the wheel. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find my security badge deactivated. The receptionist avoided my eyes as Chris walked in behind me, all fake sympathy. "There's been a board decision, Tom. We're restructuring." In 2 sentences, I was cut out of the company I built from a basement desk 10 years ago. My shares transferred through a clause I'd signed without thinking 3 years earlier. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I walked out with my laptop bag, every step locking something in place inside me. They had taken my wife, my company, my reputation in one coordinated strike. They thought that was the end. For 3 weeks, I stayed out of sight. Friends stopped calling. Emily moved into Chris's high-rise. My name disappeared from the company website. On social media, they looked untouchable. The power couple steering a fast-growing tech firm. But here's what they didn't know. I still had access to a cloud server from my earliest projects, one Chris didn't realize existed. It held contracts, design blueprints, and early-stage patents filed in my name alone. That was my leverage. While they were busy enjoying the spotlight, I was busy studying them. I learned who they met with, which investors were restless, and which journalists had been chasing rumors of shady deals in the Chicago tech scene. By the second month, I'd secured a new position under an alias, consulting for a firm that happened to be negotiating with Chris's company. I kept my head down, listened, and collected every slip of information his team let drop. The more I dug, the more rot I found. Inflated valuations, unlicensed software integrations, and contracts signed with shell companies in Delaware to hide payouts. The breaking point came when I uncovered proof of a federal compliance violation, the kind that freezes accounts and scares off major investors. I didn't leak it yet. Timing mattered. One evening, I passed Emily and Chris at a downtown restaurant. They didn't see me. They were laughing, ordering champagne. To them, I didn't exist anymore. Perfect. I paid my bill and walked out without a word. Every day that passed without me making a move was another day they believed they'd won. But I wasn't looking for a loud fight. I was building something stronger, a case so airtight that when it hit, there would be no recovery. When you've been erased, you learn 2 things fast. 1, people reveal their true selves when they think you can't touch them. 2, the quietest person in the room is usually the one keeping score, and I was keeping score. Every name, every meeting, every dollar that moved. The day I finally made my first call to the authorities, my voice was steady. I didn't tell them everything, not yet. Just enough to open the file. The rest would come when I decided it was time. Because I wasn't going to take back what they stole. I was going to make sure they couldn't keep it. The first sign they were losing control came in the form of silence. 2 weeks after I filed the initial report, Chris's company accounts were flagged for review. Investors started calling. I knew because 2 of them called me, not as Tom Reed, but as the consultant I'd become. They were careful with their words, but the tension was obvious. Money hates uncertainty. From that point, I tightened the net. I passed along documents to a journalist I trusted. Nothing explosive yet, just enough to plant questions. I didn't want headlines. I wanted doubt. Doubt is slow poison in business. Emily reached out once, a text, short and casual. "Hope you're doing okay." I didn't reply. That message wasn't concern, it was reconnaissance. She wanted to know if I was watching. I was. The second sign came during a quarterly presentation. Through my new role, I had access to a recording. Chris stumbled over key metrics. One of his senior managers contradicted him on a slide. The meeting ended early. On the surface, it was nothing, but I recognized it for what it was, the first visible fracture. While they scrambled to keep investors calm, I went after the structural weak points. I filed quiet claims on patents they were using without permission, not through lawyers directly tied to me, but through shell entities. By the time they traced the filings, the patents were already frozen for review. Behind the scenes, I kept feeding compliance officers the trail of shell companies, shady contracts, and the offshore account that Chris thought no one could find. That one was a gift from his own arrogance. He'd used the same routing code on an unrelated invoice. The third sign came when the journalist called me back. He had been chasing Chris's name for years, always hitting dead ends. My files changed that. "If even half of this is true," he said, "it's going to get ugly." I told him to hold the story until I gave the word. I wasn't done yet. It was around then I saw Emily again, this time alone. She was outside a coffee shop, pacing, phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was sharp, almost panicked. She didn't see me, I didn't approach. Whatever she was dealing with, it was just the beginning. The final piece I needed came from inside their own office. One of their mid-level analysts, overworked, underpaid, and invisible to Chris, reached out anonymously. He'd heard rumors I'd been burned. He didn't like how Chris treated people. He sent me an internal audit draft marked confidential. It confirmed everything: unreported liabilities, fabricated invoices, manipulated investor updates. I didn't rush. I compiled the files, cross-referenced every number, stripped out anything that could be dismissed as speculation. By the time I was finished, it wasn't a complaint. It was a blueprint for prosecution. On a Thursday morning, I sent the complete package to federal investigators, state regulators, and the journalist. 10 minutes later, I shut down the alias I'd been using for months. That night, I drove past the company's headquarters. The lights were still on. People moved inside like ants in a storm. Chris's car wasn't in its usual spot. Neither was Emily's. The next day, the headlines hit. Words like fraud, federal investigation, and possible criminal charges were everywhere. Their photo, the one they'd staged for a magazine cover, was now attached to the story they could never control. I didn't call anyone, I didn't post anything. I just sat at my kitchen table and watched the live news ticker run their names under the words "under investigation." It wasn't over yet. They still had money, lawyers, and a talent for survival. But they no longer had the one thing they'd relied on since the day they cut me out: control over the narrative. And that was the first thing I was taking from them. If you want, I can make part 3 the high-impact climax where their downfall becomes public, legal consequences hit, and the narrator walks away with both justice and closure, perfect for a satisfying moral ending that still fits monetization rules. The morning the subpoenas landed, my phone lit up like a switchboard. Unknown numbers, blocked numbers. Then a message from Chris. "We need to talk, man to man." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to negotiate. The paperwork had already moved past talking: freezes on accounts, holds on assets, a halt on licensing tied to my patents. Their machinery kept spinning for a few hours out of habit, then stuttered. By noon, investors scheduled an emergency call without Chris. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. 2 of them looped me afterward. They were done defending numbers that didn't add up. They wanted distance, not explanations. Money seeks cover when the ground shakes. The compliance office made its first visit the next day. Not a raid, just a quiet request for records with consequences behind it. People inside began forwarding their work email to personal accounts. Middle managers called in sick. The analyst who'd sent me the internal draft resigned. His message to me was short. Thanks for seeing what everyone pretended not to. I sent back a single line. You did the right thing. Emily wrote again, longer this time. No accusations, no excuses, just a plea to meet. I stared at the screen for a full minute and put the phone face down. Forgiveness and access are different things. I wasn't going to confuse them again. The first formal hearing was procedural. My counsel argued to restore my ownership of the original IP and enjoin their company from further commercial use. Their side tried to stall with technicalities. The judge didn't look impressed. An interim order arrived that afternoon. Immediate suspension of any product built on my filings pending review. It wasn't a final win, but it was a real boundary, one they couldn't step over without consequence. 2 days later, the journalist released the long piece he'd held. It didn't accuse, it demonstrated. Dates, transfers, contracts stacked in a chain that couldn't be waved away. The story didn't go viral in a blaze, it spread like weather, steady, unavoidable. Clients paused negotiations. A university withdrew from a pilot program. A major vendor demanded payment in advance and then walked anyway. Chris tried one more angle. He recorded a video saying the company was under attack from a disgruntled former founder. He called it a smear. Announced a countersuit. Within hours, a former controller posted her resignation letter with attachments. She hadn't kept everything, but she kept enough. The comment section stopped being a debate and turned into a ledger. I slept for the first time in weeks, not from triumph, from relief that the burden had shifted to the place it always belonged, on the facts. Settlement talks started quietly. Their lawyers floated numbers that sounded large in a headline and small against a decade of work. I declined. I wanted the structure fixed, not a check to pretend it hadn't been crooked. My conditions were simple: restore my IP, unwind the transfers, audit the books with an independent firm, notify customers of material changes, and put a compliance monitor in place for a defined term. They pushed back until the regulator made it clear a cooperative path would be considered during penalties. Suddenly, my terms looked reasonable. Emily asked for a meeting in person. I agreed to one, at a neutral office with counsel present. She apologized without the performance I'd braced for, said she'd believed promises because they were convenient, said she hated who she'd become defending them. I listened. I said I hoped she repaired what needed repairing. That's all. Closure doesn't require a shared script. The final order came on a Wednesday. My patents reverted fully. Their company admitted to material inaccuracies in prior statements. Monetary penalties were assigned. The board removed Chris and 2 directors who had approved the shell arrangements. The monitor was appointed. A rebrand followed within a week, not because a new name fixes anything, but because the old one had become a warning label. I didn't give interviews. I released one statement. I'm grateful for the process. I'm returning to the work. It wasn't poetry, but it was true. The calls quieted. The calendars cleared. The noise receded. I met the analyst who helped me at a diner near the river. No speeches. I slid a recommendation across the table and a contact for a team that won't burn him to keep a weekend afloat. He nodded like the air finally weighed less. A month later, I walked through a small incubator where a handful of founders were building without congratulating themselves every 5 minutes. I signed a short lease for a room with a door that sticks and a table that rocks if you lean too hard. It was perfect. Not because of how it looked, but because of what it didn't carry. No mythology, no politics, no one waiting to tell me where I didn't belong. On the first morning there, I opened a blank document and wrote 3 lines at the top. Don't confuse quiet with surrender. Keep records like you'll need them. If you walk away, let it be forward. I didn't send those to anyone. They weren't a manifesto, just a reminder of the road back. Chris filed an appeal. It went nowhere. Emily moved out of the high-rise. I heard she took a job in a different city. I don't wish her harm. I don't wish her back. Some chapters end without applause. People still ask if I feel vindicated. The honest answer is simpler. I feel finished with that part. Justice didn't arrive with fireworks. It showed up in signatures, audits, corrected ledgers, and a door that closed softly behind me. The day I pushed our first small update live under my own name again, there was no audience. Just a green light on a screen and the knowledge that I didn't win by shouting. I won by refusing to disappear. They thought I wouldn't find out. They were wrong. And now I'm busy. The case wrapped, but the story didn't end when the orders were signed. Systems don't reset because a judge says so. They drag their habits forward until someone forces a different pattern. That became my job, whether I wanted it or not. 2 weeks after the final ruling, a podcast ran a neat narrative: lone founder versus corrupt partner. It made for clicks, but it missed everything that mattered. This wasn't a duel, it was a culture that rewarded shortcuts and punished the person who asked for the receipts. I turned down their interview and sent them a bundle of documents titled "Controls that would have stopped us from getting here." They ran it as an appendix: fewer downloads, better use of oxygen. Then the counterpunch arrived. A burner account posted that I'd weaponized regulators to kneecap competition. The phrasing was familiar. Chris never learned a new trick if the old one still moved a crowd. I didn't engage online. I traced the domain quietly through counsel and filed a narrow defamation claim with exhibits. It wasn't about pride. It was about preventing the next victim from spending a year explaining the difference between evidence and a grudge. Meanwhile, I rebuilt for real. I rehired 2 engineers who'd left long before the scandal because no one listened to them when they flagged risk. I didn't give speeches. I gave them access, test budgets, and veto power over launches that brushed the line. We drafted a 1-page rule that sat above every roadmap. No growth metric beats a compliance metric. If they conflict, the feature waits. It slowed us down. It also meant I slept. The analyst who helped me asked if I planned to become the face of founder ethics. I told him I planned to ship, and if that required being loud about guardrails, then fine. We built a small open repository: sample audit checklists, contract red flags, a guide for employees on documenting wrongdoing without losing their job on a technicality. It got more traffic than our product page the first week. I accepted that this too was part of the work. The industry tried to move on. A trade group invited me to a panel about resilience. I said I'd attend if they changed the topic to governance, that works when ambition outruns caution. They agreed because they needed my name on the flyer. On stage, a moderator asked whether forgiveness had been part of my healing. I said forgiveness is personal and private, but controls are public, and that's what keeps people honest. The room got quiet in a useful way. Afterwards, a founder in her 20s handed me a thumb drive with logs from her company. She said the numbers on the board deck didn't match the billing system. I gave her my counsel's card and told her to back up everything twice. Sometimes help is as simple as telling someone they aren't crazy. Chris tried to reframe himself as a victim of over-regulation. His appeal failed again. He still had followers. There's always an audience for a shortcut dressed as disruption. I kept my distance until a former vendor sent a demand letter claiming my new company owed for tools licensed under the old regime. It was a trap to blur lines between entities. We answered with a clean ledger and a timeline that severed claims neatly. The vendor withdrew and, privately, apologized. I didn't gloat. Clarity is its own reward. Emily wrote once more. The message said she had repaid a bonus tied to misstated milestones and was attending weekly sessions with someone who specialized in high-pressure decision patterns. No request to meet, no revisionist history, just a record of action. I wished her well and archived the email. Some things end without a summit. The first product we shipped from the incubator wasn't flashy. It handled data migration with auditable trails by design. We priced it fairly and offered a free tier to non-profits. A regional hospital adopted it on a Friday. By Monday, their IT lead sent a note saying the audit trail had already saved them, an argument that used to take days. That single line beat every headline. I still get asked what revenge feels like. The honest answer hasn't changed. This was never revenge. It was correction. Revenge leaves the field salted. Correction leaves it playable for the next person who wants to build without lying. On the anniversary of the day my badge stopped working, I wrote down what I'd learned and mailed it to myself, postmarked and sealed. Treat signatures like loaded promises. If a clause can erase you, rewrite it or walk. Keep timelines, not grudges. When in doubt, choose the path that survives discovery. No speech, no post. Just a dated envelope in a drawer I open when the work gets loud. Late that evening, an email landed from a state school. A professor wanted to use our repository in her entrepreneurship course. She asked if I could guest lead one session on integrity under pressure. I said yes with one condition. We spend half the time practicing how to say no to investors who reward speed over truth. She agreed. That's the ending I can live with. Not a door slammed, not applause. Just better defaults, one meeting at a time, and a company that earns trust the slow way. The headlines moved on. Good, they weren't the point. The point is that the next founder who gets squeezed will have a playbook, and the next partner who reaches for the easy lie will think twice because someone before them didn't disappear. I'm still busy, different kind of busy, the kind that doesn't need a stage, only a standard. Winning didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a choice I had to keep making. The Attorney General's office asked me to brief a task force on patterns we'd exposed, how fake revenue hides inside service credits, how shell firms recycle cash through marketing partnerships, how boards excuse everything if the graph tilts up. I said yes with one non-negotiable. Whatever we built had to outlast the headlines. We wrote a simple checklist any small team could run without lawyers. It wasn't elegant, it worked. A civil class action formed around customers who'd relied on Chris's numbers. I wasn't required to be involved, but I submitted a declaration that mapped the misstatements to the contracts they'd signed. No speeches, just rows that reconciled. When the settlement landed, it created a restitution pool with a real claims process, not theatre. I donated my fee to that pool and published the receipt. People notice when money moves the right direction. Meanwhile, my company grew at a pace I could defend. We added audit hooks to every feature by default. A few prospects asked if we could be flexible on logs. We walked. Saying no cost us short-term revenue and saved months of arguing later. I hired a compliance lead before a head of sales. She caught things that engineers and I would have missed, and she wrote policies in plain language so anyone could follow them under pressure. Chris resurfaced with a podcast tour about redemption and second chances. I didn't respond. Redemption without repair is branding. He eventually took a role at a firm far from our sector. Good, some distances don't need a story. Emily sent one final email. She had completed a repayment plan and given a recorded statement to regulators confirming timelines. No request to reconnect, no defense of the past. I replied with a sentence I'd want someone to send me if the positions were reversed. Thank you for doing the work on record. Then I archived the thread and removed it from my inbox rules. Boundaries hold when you treat them like systems, not moods. The incubator filled with founders who had questions that never make keynote slides. What do you do when a big customer hints at paying off the books? How do you tell a board the real numbers without losing your job? We ran drills. We practiced saying, put that in writing, and we'll delay the launch until the review passes. We wrote template emails for moments when adrenaline overrides judgment. People used them. A few wrote back weeks later, still employed, still upright. A university invited me to help design a capstone around governance. We built a semester where the final grade required surviving a mock diligence process that tried to pressure them into shortcuts. Half the class failed the first time, most passed the second. The lesson wasn't moral theory, it was muscle memory. Not everything landed cleanly. A venture fund blacklisted me quietly for slowing innovation. Another offered term sheets with clauses that would have recreated the trap I'd escaped. I walked from both. Better to build with fewer allies than repeat the bargain that erases you when convenient. I established a small grant for employees who document misconduct responsibly, funds for counsel and time off to file reports. The grant required evidence, not drama. The first recipient was a payroll specialist who spotted ghost contractors. Her company corrected the books and kept her. That outcome mattered more than any court win I'd had. On the anniversary of the article that broke the case open, the reporter asked for a follow-up. I agreed on one condition. The piece had to center the mechanics, not me. He wrote about invoice chains, control gaps, and how small teams can resist pressure. My name showed up twice. Perfect. People still ask what I'd tell the version of me who walked out with a dead badge. I'd say, learn the documents better than anyone, choose allies who tell you no, and design your work so that telling the truth is easier than hiding it. Then I'd add the line I didn't know I needed. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep a room warm. The last legal echo closed with a brief notice. Appeal denied, monitor term completed, compliance plan adopted, no fanfare. I read it once, forwarded it to counsel, and dragged the whole matter into an archive folder labelled finished. I didn't empty the trash. I wanted the record there for the next person who might need it. That evening, our team pushed a release that passed audit on the first run. No bugs, no shortcuts, no calls from anyone asking for exceptions. I watched the telemetry roll in and shut the laptop. Not because the story was over, but because the day was. People think justice is a destination. It's not. It's a route you keep taking when the shortcut looks tempting. I don't need closure to stay on it. I need standards, witnesses, and time. They thought I wouldn't find out. They thought I'd disappear. I found out. I didn't disappear. And tomorrow, I'll ship again. The story faded from public feeds months ago, but the effects didn't. Scandals have a half-life, especially in business. The people who said nothing when it happened still measure their words around me. Some avoid me entirely. Others lean in, thinking proximity now equals safety. I don't correct them, I just watch. The task force work became a quarterly routine. We dissected new cases, most smaller in scale but identical in shape, fabricated growth, opaque vendors, boards too distracted by expansion to check the floorboards. My role wasn't to prosecute, it was to show where the fault lines start. A few of the regulators who'd been green during my case had become sharp, faster to spot the early signs. That was the point. At my own company, we hit our first major snag since launch. A large client's implementation failed because their internal data was riddled with inconsistencies they hadn't disclosed. The contract gave us an exit. Instead, we proposed a fix that required them to clean their systems before using ours. It cost us revenue in the short term, but when they passed their first clean audit in years, they renewed for double the scope. That validated the model more than any marketing could. Chris's name appeared once in an industry bulletin. He'd taken a mid-level operations role in a sector far from ours. No quotes, no fanfare. That was his problem now. I didn't reach out. The past doesn't need updates. Emily sent nothing further, and I left it that way. Silence can be a door closed or a room you don't walk back into. Either way, it stays shut. The incubator's governance program grew beyond my expectation. We partnered with a legal aid group to run monthly clinics for founders. They brought contracts, investor term sheets, even partnership agreements scrawled on napkins. We translated the fine print into plain terms. pointed out clauses that could strip them of control, and offered templates without the traps. Some walked away with deals intact, others tore them up and started fresh. Both outcomes counted as wins. A documentary team approached me about turning the case into a limited series. I declined. The moment you turn something like this into entertainment, you risk teaching the wrong lesson, that the drama is the value, not the prevention. Instead, I helped them connect with whistleblowers who could speak to systemic flaws. My story could stay on paper, theirs needed daylight. We hit a milestone, 1 full year of operations without a single compliance breach. I sent a short note to the team. 1 year clean, we keep it that way by choice, not luck. That same week, we onboarded a hospital network whose CIO said our refusal to bypass audits was why they signed. That's the kind of contract you can take home without flinching. The analyst who'd helped me in the early days took a role as head of risk at another startup. He called one evening to say they'd just walked away from a lucrative deal because the counterparty refused to document their offshore arrangements. They said we'd never grow with that attitude, he told me. I said I'd rather stay small than end up in court. That's when I knew the real work had taken root. I started keeping a living document titled Continuity. It wasn't a memoir, it was a running log of strategies, warning signs, and responses that had worked. No moralizing, no slogans, just scenarios and outcomes. Anyone in the incubator could request access. Some entries were only a few lines. If they refuse independent audit rights, walk. Others were detailed case studies with redacted contracts. Every quarter, I reviewed the log, updated what had changed, and removed what no longer applied. Standards aren't static, they adapt or they fail. The same goes for trust. Near the end of the second year, the task force invited me to keynote their conference. I agreed on the condition that it wasn't billed as a victory lap. My talk was titled, How Not to Need Someone Like Me. The message was simple. If your system depends on whistleblowers, you've already lost. The day after, a founder in the audience emailed to say they'd overhauled their vendor screening process that night. They found 2 red flags before signing their next deal. That was the kind of outcome I wanted. Not applause, but action. I still keep the original case files in a fireproof box. Not out of sentiment, but because every few months, someone asks how to start when they suspect something's wrong. I hand them a copy of my first timeline and say, this is where I began. Make your own and don't stop until it's complete. The work isn't glamorous. It's meetings, checklists, and telling people no when yes would be faster. But it's the kind of work that makes the next collapse less likely. That's not closure, it's maintenance. They thought I wouldn't find out. They thought I'd be gone by now. Instead, I'm still here, making sure the next person doesn't have to learn the hard way.